probably in the bike advocacy world in my little part of the state, but I'm enjoying it so far. The one policy that I would like to see out of the General Assembly is maintaining their trail allotment in the budget. I'll talk more about that moving forward, but this past session, 2021 session, saw the first state trails budget that I've seen since I've been paying attention for about the past 11 years, 10 years. And that certainly has the potential to be a game changer if it continues to build trails year after year.
Awesome. So my name is Jeremiah, and I'm the advocacy director here at WABA. And one policy, if I could implement one policy, what would it be? It would be concrete barriers on every major road so people can actually bike. Not like paint on the street, but actual like barriers. I was out in not Virginia, but Maryland yesterday, PG County, and they had like a bike lane that was painted. It was like in the middle of the highway, literally the middle of the highway, and there were cars running over it. I was like, that is not protection, and that's like similar to where I see in other places as well. So we need actual like real barriers of protection. So I'm going to quickly, before we go over to our panel, I'm going to quickly just share my screen because we sent out a questionnaire to candidates. And this will just kind of cue us up for the panel discussion. We sent out a questionnaire to candidates, and I compiled the data from the questionnaire. So we're not actually talking about individual candidates. We're talking about the collective data for those candidates. And I'm going to share some of that data. Give me 1 second. Can folks see this okay?
Yes.
Okay, so we sent out a questionnaire to Northern Virginia delegate candidates, so to all the candidates. And so we got 8 questions, we got 8 responses from incumbents, and then 3 responses from challengers, so 11 total questionnaires were submitted. And so this is the collective data from all of them together. So one of the questions was, we asked more questions. So this is just the yes or no data. This isn't the actual like written response data. And so I'll share out all the questionnaires later this week. So should the Virginia Department of Transportation play a larger role in building out low stress protected bike lane networks? 100% of the candidates said yes. Virginia is one of only 5 states in the United States that has a old contributory negligence rule. Do you support changing the Virginia law for contributory negligence to comparative negligence in cases where bicyclists and pedestrians are involved in accidents with cars? 100% of the candidates said yes. Do you support removing armed police from traffic enforcement and replacing them with unarmed civilian traffic enforcement? 81% of the candidates said yes. 2 candidates said no, 18%. In certain cases, do you support using street calming infrastructures in place of police enforcement to improve traffic safety? 9 candidates, 81% said yes. 1 candidate said no, and then 1 person did not respond. WMATA is essential to making the region's transportation system more equitable. Do you support investing more in WMATA for better services and more coverage? 100% of the candidates said yes. And then electric bicycles are becoming more popular and helping more people get around sustainably. Would you support a statewide e-bike incentive program to encourage more people to take up bikes to get around? 100% of the candidates, 11 candidates said yes. So that is the collective data from the yes or no responses from the questionnaire that we sent candidates. There were actually more questions than that, but the other questions were written responses. And I'll share out all of the candidates' questionnaires later this week. The question was, can we get a list of candidates who respond to the survey? Absolutely, yes. I will be sending out all of the questionnaires later this week. I'll post them on the blog post, and then I'll email folks that blog post with a link to each person's questionnaire. So I'll be compiling all that information and sending it to everybody later this week. With that said, we have some really interesting things from candidates. And so I think this really tees us up for the next General Assembly, thinking about, okay, well, what are some of the focus areas where you can push some of the delegates. And so with that said, let's move over to some of I have a few prepared questions I want to ask our panelists, and then I'll give folks in the audience an opportunity to ask questions. So I just have about 4 or 5 questions I've already prepared, and then we'll give y'all the opportunity to ask questions. So, so let's start first. The first question I have is, tell us some of the setbacks or challenges that you think occurred during this past General Assembly. And we'll start with you, Wyatt.
Setbacks and challenges. I would say in the walking and biking realm, one of the biggest challenges we had, which Brantley, feel free to jump in whenever. Bicyclist Safety Act was definitely a tough lift, and I think getting 2 out of 3 of the major policy goals out of that passed through was really wonderful. Putting the 3rd off into a study is kind of the Virginia way of kicking the can down the road and convincing some folks later. So I think where we're at politically, this is kind of the best we could have expected. And I think a lot of us were prepared for the Bicyclist Safety Act to not pass at all, given some of the opposition we face in the Senate and just kind of a lack of awareness and an accurate understanding of what yielding at stop signs for a safety measure means for cyclists. I think we recognize that there's an education gap with some of our lawmakers who are not bikers themselves. So when you hear a policy and you think that, cyclists are just never going to stop at a stop sign ever again, and you think, okay, they're going to blow through and I might hit them, it sounds scary. But I think what was really shown is, Brantley, along with all of the wonderful regional advocates we have in a lot of bike groups in Virginia, were able to do that education and to explain to lawmakers what the policy actually means, how it boosts cyclist safety, how in other states like Delaware, it's really lowered the accident rates for cyclists and reduced injuries and fatalities at intersections. And once you have that level of data, then we saw a lot of people kind of change their mind on the issue. So at least for me, one of the things I took out of this session is really the importance of investing in ground level groups who are willing to organize, reach out to lawmakers, and to be advocates in their community and in the districts of lawmakers in a way that we as state level folks can put that information forward, but it's so much more convincing when it comes from one of their own constituents.
That was very thorough, so I got to think about what I can add to that. It's a really good summary. And I try not to think about these things too negatively. I think that it's really easy to kind of frame something as impossible, and so you never do it. I think that we had market success this year, not just in the Bicyclist Safety Act and the 15-mile-per-hour bill, but in terms of building relationships with legislators, communicating the issue, bringing new people in to be advocates both from like the messenger standpoint, but from the message standpoint, but also the messenger, making sure that we're representing this issue with a statewide coalition, that we have a lot of diversity and the people who are advocating for it. I thought those were really valuable and that we should continue to do that. I think one of the things, I think that Wyatt touched on it, is sort of like a difference of perspective about how we understand data. The House was convinced by the safety statistics that we brought to the table, and the Senate were not. And the Senate didn't necessarily have the same, I guess, threshold of understanding. Like, they want to chew on it for 3 years before they really want to take a vote in support of something. And at least we know that's kind of what the rules of engagement are, and we can keep that going. But I certainly felt I sensed a feeling in the Senate in particular that there wasn't an understanding that bicyclist safety laws actually benefit everyone. It's not just this special interest group or one kind of person. Like, we spent a lot of time talking about the change lanes to pass element of the Bicyclist Safety Act that really benefits drivers and the flow of traffic too. We made some major progress on it, and I hope that we continue to build it, but it's certainly room for improvement.
Awesome, thank you. Let's move over to our second question. We're going to stay with you, Brantley. Tell us what you think are some of the biggest achievements or steps forward that occurred during this past General Assembly.
Very good question. And what I think, I'm going to give you a little bit of a political answer, if that's okay. What I think is we saw the biggest level of support and sort of like consistent level of support from the Virginia Legislative Black Caucus that bicycling issues have ever had, at least since I've been paying attention for about the past 10 years. I think that the discussion of equity and equitable outcomes in transportation was at the forefront of this issue. And you don't see pedestrian fatality rates, or bicycling fatality rates at the same levels as you see pedestrian fatality rates. And so the Bicyclist Safety Act didn't have the same kind of urgency as things like decriminalizing jaywalking from the 2020 session, and that was by Delegate Patrick Hope, who carried that bill. And but just because the sense of scale is a little bit different. But when we were having conversations about who gets pulled over for running stop signs, there's not a ton of substantive data. And what I would really like to see Virginia do is focus more on that data collection of who's getting tickets for what. Is it a problem? And our sense is from other states and in Virginia that getting tickets for running stop signs is not a huge issue. I haven't heard about like a bunch of tickets that shouldn't have been given or targeted enforcement. So if that's the case, then, and we don't have huge bicyclist fatality and injury rates, then does it really need to be illegal? I certainly think that those conversations were really valuable, and I think that they didn't run their course. We have a lot more work to do with the gathering that data, making the case for equitable freedom of movement, and we certainly want to see the next session continue to build on that. And I do want to say I didn't give a very good summary of the Bicyclist Safety Act. It was a 3-part bill, 2.5 parts of it passed. Drivers will now be required to change lanes to pass on as of July 1st when they can't give 3 feet and share the lane in the same space. What we think that means is that most lanes are too narrow to share a lane and give 3 feet. So most of the time, except for when you're in a very wide lane, you'll be required to change lanes. There's some interpretation. This is a perennial problem with legislation. It's like you make the law, and then the people who have to carry out the law have different opinions, and it's an evolution. But I think we made a really big step on that. Dovetailing with that is bicyclists are no longer required to single up if they're being approached by traffic from the rear. Really great for family riding and parents being able to ride outside of their children or other family members, so that or a newer rider, so that they can be safer and more protected. And it makes groups of riders half as long, so cars can pass them much more expeditiously while also being safe. And then the part that didn't pass was the safety stop, which would be allowing bicyclists to treat a stop sign as a yield sign. That turned into a study that's being conducted by Virginia State Police. And I'll be a part of that very small working group and sort of I or my designee will be gathering all the data to bring to that work group so that they understand the best safety numbers and everything else that the General Assembly will want to see in December when that report is due. So the safety stop did not pass, but turned into a study, and that'll get started in July. We've already started doing some of that data collection, and my hope, and I am convinced by the numbers, obviously, and Alan actually brings up a point in the chat that it's not the safety stop, which is basically half of the Idaho stop because it doesn't change anything about stoplights, is not universally supported by the bicyclist community, but it's pretty heavily supported by the bicyclist community, and most issues are not universally supported generally. So it's okay. And what I think in terms of working through some of the challenges, and I'll bring up the regional aspect of this later, but I definitely want to bring up the fact that the summarized questions and answers from the Northern Virginia caucus are not what you will see statewide. And if you want to be able to have that, grow that support for these issues in Western Virginia, South, to be able to bring the right messenger to those delegates and senators so that they find an issue that they can, or a reason for them to support something like that. And we were pretty successful in that in the House, in particular, for the Bicyclist Safety Act. I think that's one of the rare instances where the regional groups don't have as much power and the statewide groups have more power. I think generally regional groups have more power than statewide groups in this kind of focus area. But folks like Virginia Bicycling Federation, Virginia Conservation Network, the Virginia Trails Alliance, those organizations have more statewide relationships, and they can kind of tune the message to the recipient of that message. So it's a long-winded answer to say that equity is becoming a part of it, and that's it's been effective for our policymaking, and that the kind of increased statewide coordination of multiple partners, I think, definitely helped us get votes that we weren't expecting to get.
Awesome. Wyatt, question for you. Tell us about some of the achievements or steps forward this past General Assembly.
Yeah, Brantley hit on a lot of them. I mean, the Bicyclist Safety Act was a huge win, even just for its symbolism of being able to push big things. Previously, I would say kind of the biggest political win that had been attributed to bikers' involvement was a lot of the hands-free laws about cell phones and driving. I think that push forward really created some relationships that VBF and other groups in Virginia were able to build off of and kind of translate into the Bicyclist Safety Act. Quite a few of the other bills we have, we had a bill that was really focusing on the zebra crosswalks, which has been commuted into a study. So once we get the feedback on that, we should hopefully be able to push for a very high standard of crosswalk safety for all new and updated crosswalks in the Commonwealth. One bill that Brantley mentioned that I think has gone a little bit under the radar was HB 1903 from Delegate Carr. This allows localities now drop the speed limit in certain business and residential districts to 15 miles per hour, whereas previously in Virginia, the minimum allowed was 25 miles per hour. We have yet to see any localities make that change yet. It's been kind of a quick turnaround, but I think this is one of the effective strategies, is to really empower local groups to speak with their city council, their county board of supervisors, and to really kind of push this change from the grassroots level. So now it's not local officials saying, oh, I'm sorry, we can't do that because the General Assembly hasn't given us that power. But rather now when you have conversations with your city council member or your county official, they don't have an excuse anymore. If you want to have a safer community in Arlington or Roanoke or Fairfax, you can talk to your local official and say, I know you have this authority, so why aren't you doing it? I think all of those things are really important. I think it feeds grassroots, and I think that's what we're really missing the most, is grassroots organizing, just concerned neighbors and residents who are talking to their officials and telling them the safer streets that they would like to live on. I I would say probably one of the biggest wins came in the form of the $10 million that we got for trails funding out of the budget. We saw that number bounce around a lot. It went from 5 million to I think 50 million to 10 million to 40 million to back to 10 million. And one of the things I think that is so exciting about that is that it was bipartisan support as well. One of the biggest backers of this, and to my understanding, the senator who kind of first got this into the budget was Senator Emmett Hanger, who's a Republican around Harrisonburg. We're starting, I think we're moving towards a bipartisan coalition that backs access to outdoor recreation and sees trails as a viable way to do that. I think a lot of rural communities are also coming on board with the idea that these types of trails can be real tourism and job boosters, as well as recreation and transportation connections. Based on the success of the Virginia Creeper Trail, we're now seeing Shenandoah Valley really excited to have their own rail trail. We also see the Eastern Shore pushing for that. So we're seeing a lot of typically more conservative areas in Virginia coming on board to the idea that maybe this is something worth it. My hope is that means we're building towards a very durable coalition of people who are willing to back ever more funding to bike infrastructure. We're seeing some of our more Northern Virginia folks, thinking specifically Senator Surville, he started talking about e-bike rebates. So I think there's a growing consensus that offering people safe ways to get around is worthy of state funding. And I also just want to underscore what Brantley was saying earlier about building inroads with the Virginia Black Legislative Caucus, Virginia Legislative Black Caucus. Always get those mixed up. But I think the growing influence is because we have advocates in Virginia who are starting to talk about why funding bike infrastructure is important in a different way. We're not getting so caught up in the grainy policy details of what type of infrastructure, but we're starting to push forward a message of who is this for and what is it good for? And by focusing on families, focusing on people that have access to vehicles, we're starting to frame bicycling infrastructure in a way where it's not just, white guys in Lycra who are benefiting from this, but like this is really infrastructure that makes everyone across the Commonwealth safer. Whether you hop on a bike or not, the presence of bike infrastructure we've seen has lowered accidents dramatically on roads that kind of get those road diets. So I think the way we're talking about bicycle infrastructure as something that is good for everyone is kind of beginning to spread and boost that political power so that hopefully we are moving towards dedicated funding for trails and bike infrastructure going forward, and maybe even something like e-bike rebates.
Awesome. So I'm gonna let you sip your water. That was a great answer. So I'm going to combine the next two questions. So we're going to stay with you, Wyatt, but I'm going to combine the next two questions. So what are some legislative priorities you think advocates should be aiming for next year? So we're focusing on this upcoming General Assembly, because we know once the General Assembly ends, the next one begins the next day. And so the fight always continues. And so what are some legislative priorities you think bike advocates should be aiming for next year? And I guess combining that question, what do you think are some ways that we, folks in the audience, listening, can better engage elected officials on our issue during when the General Assembly is not in session? And so how can we engage our delegates and our state senators when things are not in session? What are some of the strategies around that? So I'm gonna keep it with you, Wyatt.
Okay. Well, the $10 million we saw is unprecedented, super exciting money for trails. It's so far from being enough, though. It's really, really exciting and amazing that we did this thing for the first time ever, but it is simultaneously nowhere near the amount of money that we need. Brantley, do you know how much the amount that's required for the Fall Line Trail in Richmond, which is once completed, I think going to be, just give the details of how much money we need for just that one trail.
It's 43 miles from Ashland to Petersburg, and the latest number is about just over 150 million. So that's what, $3 million a mile. So $3 million a trail. Obviously, there's lots of apples and oranges here, but $10 million doesn't buy you a lot, but it's good seed money.
Exactly. So when we're thinking about some of the more rural trails, I know the price per mile goes down a bit because it's a little less complex, especially if it's a rail to trail. But that's just to give a good idea of how much money is really needed. When we think about the budget for even just one project that VDOT is running, like Hampton Bay Bridge Tunnel, that's $4.6 billion. So I think where we really need to be focusing is on how do we shift VDOT away from its mission of just expanding miles and building more highways. We're going to tackle in agency level. That's something that we also need to focus on at the regional level. We have these regional entities that collect their own revenues and distribute those, whether it's the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority, the Central Virginia Transportation Authority, the Hampton Roads Transportation Accountability Council Commission. We've got a lot of unaccountable regional dollars that are just flowing into more car infrastructure. So thinking about how do we shift our funding to reducing car dependency so that families can really think about shifting down to being a one-car household, having biking, whether it's e-bikes, regular bikes, walking and transit being sustainable alternatives for them. I think that's going to be a super huge challenge. Tying into that, e-bike rebates. We just saw France is now offering $3,000 to every household that wants to trade in an old car. That's a remarkable model, something that I would love to see here in Virginia. We're going to have to just, it's going to get tricky because we have to get a little bit more into the weeds and a little bit more into depth around the structural problems in the way we think about transportation in Virginia. For example, like we fund a lot of our transportation infrastructure through a program called Smart Scale, which is revolutionary, award-winning, amazing, has cut a lot of pork barrel spending out of our transportation investments. However, it also doesn't do enough to really focus on reducing car dependency, focusing on our climate crisis. Still way too much money goes through that and gets allotted to road infrastructure that isn't just safety upgrades, maintenance, it's actual expansion of highways. So we're going to need to start thinking about how do we reorient so much of this large bureaucratic infrastructure and funding models to the new goals we want to set for ourselves in the coming decades to century of like, that really need to be focused on people. How do we achieve transportation equity, mobility for everyone, making sure everyone has options to get where they need to go when they need to get there. And then also thinking about the climate crisis. You know, in Virginia, we know 48% of all of our carbon pollution comes directly from transportation. 37% of the whole state's transportation pollution comes directly from single occupancy vehicles. So we're going to have to really dig deep into that. To try and answer the second part of your question, it's important to be engaged during the General Assembly, of course. It's sometimes even more important to be engaged outside of that. Lawmakers very rarely hear from constituents to congratulate them on things that they did that were well. So, you know, please look at your local representative and see if they voted in favor of some of these bills that you like. Tell them thank you for doing that. Explain to them why you care about other bills that they may not have voted in favor of. It's always important to be polite, lawmakers like to be thanked. They generally don't like to be scolded. So if you can try and frame your passion in a way where you're saying, I would love for you to do this thing next time, that would really earn my vote. Those types of things are really helpful. But yeah, staying involved with your local lawmaker as much as you can outside of just the General Assembly is super important. Even if it's just ahead of the General Assembly saying, hey, the Virginia Bicycling Federation is looking to do this cool policy. Like, I'd love if you supported this. Very, very little things can kind of build soft power with lawmakers. So just do the small things that show you're paying attention throughout the year and not just when you need them to take that one vote.
Very excellent answers. I'd like to kind of start with, oh, we got a kitty. Now I forgot how I was going to start with this. So what I think, I want to riff off your statement that elected officials, legislators are elected. So there's a bit of popularity that has to be a part of this, and they have to get in front of people. So advocates have an opportunity to be creative in ways that they really can't, and getting people in front of a group of people that is related to an issue. And so I just went to I would certainly say take opportunities to do this kind of event as appropriate. But 2 weeks ago, I went to an event that was a tree planting memorial for a 16-year-old girl who was killed before crossing the street. She was standing on a sidewalk before even going into the sidewalk, and a crash happened in front of her that was speed and sunlight visibility related. And she was killed while standing on the sidewalk because of where the cars went. Just tragic all around. And the family, unlike many people who were killed in traffic, the family, instead of slinking away, chose to turn into advocacy and said, we're going to make a difference out of this moment and try to save the next person's life. They hosted this event at a local high school or middle school where this girl went, and had the mayor, had the local city council person, and had the local delegate all there to talk about what they're doing from a policy and legislation standpoint to save that next person's life. It happened to be in Betsy Carr's district, who was the champion of the HB 1903, the 15-mile-per-hour bill. So she was able to talk about her leadership on the issue. The mayor was able to talk about his Vision Zero policy, and Councilman Jones was able to talk about the city council's need to fund investments in under-resourced parts of the city that are all basically historically racially based, and it's a major problem and probably something that happens in a lot of your communities as well. That's making change and getting people's attention because they were able to get the news coverage. Each of these elected officials was able to get in front of people and show that they care and that they're doing the right work. A vacuum of those kinds of things does not build any kind of power with that elected official. It doesn't help them get creative about the policy making, and it doesn't give them a passion when they're in these backroom discussions with their caucuses to say, like, I'm really going to fight for this issue, or our caucus is going to support this issue. You have to put a face in front of it. You have to put a story to it, and they literally cannot do it themselves. It has to be us. So if you can show the face of someone who was killed, you can show the face of someone whose life was changed for the better because they started riding bikes. That is your entree into being able to work with them. You don't have to know everything about policy making. You're never going to know as much as them. You don't have to. Like that, we all have kind of a role to play here. And the more you can kind of get into their hair in a good way, outside of the really messy, noisy, chaotic legislative making process, the more they're likely to remember it. Just get a couple of your fellow riders or your bike club members or WABA members and get a meeting with them. They'll probably meet you and ask them what they're doing to support infrastructure projects, what they're doing to support safer streets, and give them your ideas about what you think could be beneficial from a policy standpoint. And I'm going to take this to a little bit of the next level. And tomorrow, I'm going to give a little bit of plug for some of my friends who are putting on another conference where I'm speaking tomorrow, the Virginia United Land Trusts conference is tomorrow, and it's very trails heavy, and I'm doing a trails session as a part of that conference, and it's free. A lot of trail building has, is born in national decisions. So Congress, Senate, the President, the Secretary of Transportation, and earmarks have come back after 10 years, which is a lot of people are like there's a bit of chagrin about earmarks, but earmarks are legislative pots of money that legislators can bring back, Congress people and senators can bring back to their districts for projects that kind of bypasses a lot of the bureaucracy and gets much more better policy making and deal making, and it allows it sort of bypasses the gridlock that we've seen for the past 10 years in Congress. A number of trail projects have risen through that. Spanberger, McEachin, Luria, Bobby Scott, or at least 4 of our Virginia Congress people who have submitted earmarks, and that was a process that mostly took place last month, and they're going to be going through their, their allocation this month, to get upwards of $25 million for trail projects in their districts. And I think that infrastructure is the most impactful thing that we can do for biking safety. You mentioned to Jeremiah the concrete barriers. One of the biggest reasons why we can't do that is the money for those infrastructure projects, even though they pale in comparison to car stuff. It seems like that's such an expensive thing. The other thing is, how many people can you move in a particular infrastructure project? We think of roads as being able to move the most people. Some studies show that actually you can move more people with transit and bike infrastructure, but not everyone is sold on that. So I think that the silver bullet is infrastructure, and the more money we can get, like if we're going to get more money in earmarks almost definitely this year than that $10 million state budget. And those trail, the Eastern Shore Trail, some pedestrian improvements that I think are related to the boat trail, and and then more requests for the Fall Line Trail could easily come up to like $50 million, and that money will come down from the government like that and be easy to spend, and that only happened because local advocates got meetings with their congressperson, which is super hard to do, right? It's not super hard to do. It feels super hard to do. It actually is probably easier than you think if you just reach out to their office and you work with your MPO, which is your local transportation, your local planning district, but they have a transportation element too. If you have a shovel-ready project and you can take it to your congressperson takes it to get an earmark, it could be, you roll your dice well, you might actually end up getting $10 or $25 million for that project. That otherwise, those dots never got connected. And so just try to fill in that space. And then if you get any kind of success, go to the groundbreaking, go to the ribbon cutting, go to the bill signing. Those things are super important because, Delegate Hurst from Blacksburg, who carried the Bicyclist Safety Act, really put himself out there. And also, from like a very frank, and I thank him very much, and I think that he would agree when I say this. He didn't know that he was getting into such a controversial subject, and I was like, I did try to tell you, but at the same time, I'm glad that he did it. And his his background in not being a super bike specialist person was such an advantage because he wasn't a zealot himself. He was a regular guy who could tell a good story, and he cared about the issue. It was able to get the line. So given that, I would say, we want to do a ribbon cutting with him or a bill signing in July when everything comes into effect, get a little press out of it, and think about ways that you can do that. Be creative, and get your delegate, your senator, your congressperson, your federal senator in front of people.
Awesome, thank you. So we have just 2 quick more questions, and then we're going to take it to the audience. Let's look like if we could just maybe spend about 2 minutes on these last 2 questions. All right, if someone is, I know we kind of answered it already, so this is a little bit repetitive. But if there's anything else y'all want to leave with the audience for how they can get involved and engage in any particular way, whether it's the work that you're doing, how can folks listening, get involved and engage. So if someone's listening, like, okay, well, like, I want to do something. How do they do it? And then lastly, transportation equity has been a key transportation conversation this past year. I've heard quite a few elected officials say it a lot. Equity, they've been using it a lot on enrichment. I would love to hear kind of what your organizations are doing to really incorporate that into your organizing. So before we throw it over to the audience, if maybe you can just maybe in the next, say, 2 minutes or less, kind of what can folks do to get involved in general, and then how do we incorporate transportation equity into our work? So I'll start with you, Wyatt.
Join your local bike group. A lot of power is at the local level. Hearing, lawmakers hearing from the Shenandoah Valley Bicycling Coalition, way more important than hearing from me at Virginia Conservation Network as a state organization. They expect to hear from me. That's my job. They don't expect to hear from someone in their district who cares super strongly about this thing. I would also just say, like, contact your officials, whether they're state, congressional, local, regional. They are hearing from people who want car infrastructure all the time. You know how car people complain about potholes. So they're hearing from them. They don't always hear from us just because we're kind of used to being ignored. So I think it's important to shift your expectation and ask them to do things, ask them to pay attention, at least help put this on their radar. In terms of transportation equity, I think this is how we build a coalition. Brantley was talking about how he's made a lot of inroads in working with the Black Caucus here in Virginia. And it's because we have a certain image in our mind of what a cyclist looks like. And that tends to be a wealthier recreationalist. Who we don't really see, the people who tend to be invisible in our policymaking, are people who rely upon bicycles for transportation, which tend to be overwhelmingly people of color. So I think when you reframe who cycling infrastructure is for, how it's safe for people who have kids and want to have their kids be able to bike to school, how it helps to boost safety for households that have less access to a car, no access to a vehicle. You start to kind of make those intersectional connections. And I think that intersectionality is how we build a broader coalition for more cycling funding, cycling infrastructure, so that we're not seen to be just kind of advocating for the lycra crowd, but we're actually building a cycling safe commonwealth for everyone, even if you only want to ride your bike, once a year.
I'm going to start off with a plug for my organization. We're going through a bit of an inflection point because I was just recently elected president after our longtime president stepped down. And it's a once in a generation kind of opportunity. And we're really on the precipice of starting a strategic planning initiative. And we really want to make sure that we have stakeholder and member engagement from around the state. So we want to make sure that we are hearing the needs from folks. So we've got a bigger than most people know, diverse state. Wise County is closer to 6 state capitals than Richmond, which is just a wild thing to think about. And we got Terry Kilgore to vote for the Bicyclist Safety Act. Terry Kilgore in Wise County. So there's a understanding the state is a tricky thing, and there are only a few organizations in this space that really have the complex understanding of what all the different corners of the state look like and how they operate. And we want to make sure that we're incorporating that into the work that we're doing. We don't currently have a DEI, which is diversity, equity, or inclusion statement or any kind of policy, and that's something that I would love to have us build into the way that we operate. And I would encourage all of your organizations to do the same thing. But we want to make sure that it is holistically done, that it includes stakeholder input. It's not just what we decide, because we'll probably forget something, and we want to make sure that it's right. So we look forward to contributing to that. And we also, I recognize that some of the folks on our call, I think maybe we might have lost one or two. there's the casual bicyclist group, and we recognize there is a lot of diversity in the kinds of riders that we have. I think that, that's why I think infrastructure is that silver bullet, because it works for everyone. And, you don't need a special bike. You don't need any special athleticism or skill. We're talking about building like a road infrastructure that's a public asset. This doesn't require cars. That's kind of the big thing there. On the equity aspect, again, I went back in March. George Mason University had an all-day conference that had a keynote speaker by Dr. Charles T. Brown, who I certainly recommend learning everything that he talks about. He has a multi-point list of including equity into your work that is very comprehensive, and really I recommend looking at it. And one of those things that I think was beneficial to our work this year was not only did we amplify voices of people of color and all ages and abilities and genders and parent status and all kinds of things like that. We did it authentically. We didn't speak for anyone. We allowed people to opt into the work that we did, and we helped share their message in a way that we could do it without, there was nothing belittling or we didn't commandeer anyone's messaging. We intend to continue to do that, and I found it in 1 year of this kind of model, I found it to be very effective with the Virginia Legislative Black Caucus and helping our legislators who don't think about bike stuff all that often understand what we were talking about. Like, we're talking about saving lives, we're talking about preventing people from getting unnecessary tickets, and helping people experience economic freedom, freedom of movement, access to jobs and education. Like, understanding how bikes play into the bigger picture of people's lives and aspirations is the only way we're going to be effective as in a General Assembly environment where bikes are only the primary focus of maybe 3 legislators.
Awesome. We just got a few minutes, but I want to definitely throw it to the audience. Just FYI, this is being recorded. So we will be sending this out to WABA members. Afterwards, I'll put this in an email and then send this recording out to WABA members. If folks have any issue with that, definitely let me know. But we will be uploading this to YouTube and then sending it out to WABA members. This is also being recorded on Facebook as well, live recording. So
I'd recommend just reading Jillian's comment / question, because I think she's on the money and be a great way to kind of end our talk.
Absolutely. So please, and I'm gonna emphasize, please support your family biking groups and your school system Safe Routes to Schools program. Starting kids biking young is so important, and it has a direct tie to municipal savings and better educational outcomes. Kids on bikes can be great advocacy tools. Jillian, I'm gonna allow you to talk too, if you want to say a little bit more quickly about your comment. I know I just read your comment, but if you want to expand upon it, feel free to.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you guys for hosting this. This is so important, and I'm so excited to see all of this energy looking at improving things in Virginia. Just a second on the Safe Routes to Schools and getting kids biking. Safe Routes to Schools is a national program that has a state component that encourages active transportation in elementary and middle school kids. And Arlington is a great poster child for this, because we were actually running out of space to park our school buses. And so as our school system grew, we knew we had a problem that we couldn't just buy more school buses to transport more kids. And we're a tiny county. So we've invested a whole lot in a Safe Routes to Schools program to get more kids walking and biking to school. Because we knew if we just had them driven to school by their parents, that we would clog up our roads. And school-related traffic can account for anywhere between 15% and a third of all traffic in the mornings, all car traffic in the mornings. So it's a lot of savings when you can get kids walking and biking to school. Biking, of course, is a great option because you can get kids from further away. And then if kids are active in the morning, there's lots of studies out there that show that they have better educational outcomes. So it's a good, positive way that can save money for your municipalities, make education better, and introduce biking in a really positive way. So it's a good it's a good tool, and there's family bike groups all across the state, and under either Kidical Mass or family group rides or safe routes to schools. They always need support, they always need volunteers to help ride with them, and then take some cute pictures and invite electeds to go with you on those rides to really highlight that we need an all ages and abilities bike network. Because if it's going to work for my second grader to get to school, then it's going to work for everybody else.
Awesome. Thank you so much. If anyone has a pressing question, feel free to put it in the chat right now. If not, we're going to wrap up because we're just at time, just at 6:30. But if you have a question for the panelists, feel free to email me and I'll send it over to them. If they're so obliged to answer. But let me also thank the panelists for joining us today. I really, really appreciate it. Thank y'all so much. This past General Assembly rocked. I mean, I was like involved, but also I was like sitting, I was taking a back seat admiring, because this was kind of my first General Assembly in Virginia, really advocating. And so it was really a pleasure to see y'all, organize and see so many other folks organize as well. And
it's definitely a weird one, Jeremiah. Like, it's going to be different moving forward, I think. And on that one, I will say that Wyatt and I and a lot of people in our space in probably October, November recognized that if we were going to be effective, we had to think about engaging our legislators differently. We weren't bumping elbows in hallways, which is like really important method that we would have for like getting latest update on a bill or discussion or finding out what the problems are. And like, it's almost like silly to think about a bunch of people in Navy suits all bumping elbows in the Capitol, but like really effective, efficient work happened there, and we weren't able to do it. We were all texting. We were all, if you didn't have someone's number or email, you were not able to do work with that person. So the more you can do beforehand, the better. Like, if you can get the staffer's cell phone number, important sequence, that is your ticket. Otherwise, you're going to have a hard time. Like, they're just not going to read your email, most likely. They also have a bunch of, almost all staffers have their official email address that they monitor for their boss, but they have like their, ex-candidate, ex-delegate at forva.com email address. Like, that's their real email address. And if you don't have that one, you're going to have a hard time reaching a lot of these folks in like the noisy, chaotic environment. I haven't thought about this in a minute, but I expect that when the General Assembly will have a more in-person model come January, in part because of vaccinations and the cost of the last one. I think the opportunity cost of doing business the way that they were used to doing. It'll be a long session, which means organizations like ours will be able to have probably 2 or 3 more bills than we'd normally be able to carry. So I can't necessarily promise that the bike movement, which is, my organization is only one of them, will be able to carry e-bikes, contributory negligence, safety stop, and a big trail budget. And maybe there's something else in there, I don't know. But we certainly will do our best to like read the politics and strategize around it to see what has the best shot.
awesome. Thank you so much. Wyatt, any closing thoughts? I'm gonna kick it over to you. Any closing thoughts before we wrap up tonight?
Just get engaged. It can feel really like people talking in a high castle of what's happening in Virginia, but it's really not. It's a pretty accessible process. Lawmakers are fairly accessible. There's a lot of great works, a lot of great groups who've been doing this work for decades and haven't had political wins at their backs. So this is a very exciting time to get involved in Virginia. Especially I think in Northern Virginia, we've had a lot of people who have been super engaged locally, super engaged nationally, and have kind of looked towards Richmond and felt a little hopeless about the prospects of getting the things passed that they wanted. It's a new Virginia, it's a blue Virginia. So if you want to get involved, push your local lawmakers on all of those issues. it's one thing to respond to a survey questionnaire and say you're in favor of doing things. It's another to put your money where your mouth is. So hold their feet to the fire, tell them you really care, and just be ready to keep engaging, and you'll probably even make some good friends out of it, because bike people are pretty fun people.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank y'all so much. Let me also thank everyone who joined us and who's watching from Facebook as well. As I mentioned before, I'll be sending out a recording of this event through email, and so I'll also be sending out all the candidates who submitted a questionnaire. I'll be sending it to everybody as well, so you'll have opportunity to review the questionnaires for all the candidates who submitted one. So let me also again thank the panelists for joining us tonight. Really appreciate y'all, and look forward to fighting in the year ahead. So thank y'all so much.